We get started, Luke? All right. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to LAPOP's workshop on international survey methods. It's a great pleasure to have with us Patrick Moynihan today. Pat is Associate Director for International Research Methods at Pew Research Center. And he's going to share with us a little bit about the challenges that the pandemic has presented. So Pat will present, and then we'll have an opportunity for Q&A. You can raise your hand through the Zoom function. You can put questions into the chat. You can also use the Q&A feature at any time, and Luke and I will try to keep an eye on those. So Pat, thanks for joining us. Looking forward to the presentation and the discussion.
No, absolutely. Appreciate being here. It's a real pleasure for me to join these conversations. And greetings to everyone out there. My name is Patrick Moynihan, as Noam said. I'm the Associate Director of International Research Methods at Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C. And I want to thank everyone for taking an hour out of their day to join us. Let's see, make sure I can get the tech going. All right, for today's talk, to jump into it, folks, I have a reporter's questions list here, a general roundup of where I'm headed. In short, I'll highlight some key features of the Center's international polling and how we've adapted to the pandemic. Like a lot of things these days, there are many unknowns right now in the survey industry, and the impact of the outbreak is unfolding, and I think it will continue to unfold differently across countries and regions. So it's a challenging situation, and frankly, in some ways, the most challenging thing I've faced in my career in the industry. But at the same time, it's an exciting time in the sense that necessity is often the mother of invention. And I firmly believe that Pew Research Center and the industry more broadly are pivoting in ways that will likely benefit us going forward, really in the long run, to create a more resilient survey infrastructure. So it's challenging, but really exciting. A few framing remarks, if you don't mind. The one asked I'd make of Noam, Luke attendees, is to continue the conversation on how best to do this important work that we all do. So hopefully it doesn't stop here. For those not familiar with sociologist Mark Granovetter's work, the strength of weak ties mentioned on the slide refers to how we can often learn more from different networks than our own, as there's a sort of clustering effect of knowledge and information within networks. So in that vein, this forum and the ones with the whole series, so let's take advantage of that opportunity. I'd humbly state that what I shared today speaks to my experience at Pew Research Center conducting cross-national research, and how we do our research aligns with our objectives. And it's certainly not the same objectives as all other organizations that have different purposes, different resources, and alternative ways of doing their work. But hopefully what I share today will give folks something to think about when they go back to their offices. And frankly, in a self-interested way, what would be better for me would be for folks to share what works for them and what doesn't, to inform my thinking. All right. A few basics about Pew Research, if folks aren't aware. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan, non-advocacy fact tank. Our funding comes primarily from the Pew Charitable Trusts, but we also receive support from other foundations. And our mission is to create and report high-quality survey research to inform public conversations and decision-making. And I thought it was important to emphasize the core mission of the center when it comes to a methods workshop. objectivity, accuracy, rigor, transparency, and innovation. Methodology, especially when it comes to cross-national polling, where a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work, needs to be incredibly realistic about what we can and cannot do. And we have to hold ourselves accountable, which means acknowledging the limits of what we know. And that's really the transparency element, both within our own organizations and with the public at large. The center includes a number of thematic research teams focusing on different aspects of social, political, and economic life. And we have two dedicated survey methodology teams, one for domestic research and one for international research. And having two methods teams is an acknowledgement that surveying in the US and cross-nationally are very different exercises, and they are both incredibly resource intensive and challenging. A little background on our general approach. Cross-national surveys have been a staple of Pew Research Center for 2 decades now, primarily through our global attitude survey, an annual project. But we've done many other projects as well. Last year, for instance, we completed an ambitious survey in India with 29,999 cases across the entire country, and we've been releasing reports from that study over the past few months. Global attitudes prior to the pandemic was usually fielded in 20 to 40 countries using nationally representative samples, using face-to-face methods in some countries and phone in others. And in terms of questionnaire content, Global Attitudes covers many topics, including those listed here, but other projects can have different content. The India study I mentioned focused on tolerance and segregation across the major religious groups. Now, if you're thinking or wondering why I have a picture of soup here, it's not because I'm thinking about lunch. It's an image from a Pew Research Methods 101 video explaining probability samples, and it refers to the popular analogy of taking a probability sample is like taste testing soup, where you don't have to take a whole pot of soup to get a sense of the flavor, but a small taste or a sample. But now I am thinking a little bit about lunch, folks. All right. In terms of geographic coverage, here's a map showing the countries we've polled in since 2001 across all center projects. Don't try and count them. I've done it for you. It's 113 in total. The shaded areas indicate countries where we've surveyed in, and the different colors indicate simply just different regions of the world. And the unshaded ones are places just that we haven't polled. Outside of the US for the past year, all other countries were surveyed using telephone interviewing exclusively. I'll say more about that in a moment. A small number of countries have used one method and then another over time. Italy, for instance, switched from face-to-face to phone surveying a couple of years ago, and that made sense for a number of reasons, which I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. So how have we adjusted to the pandemic? Well, we've written a couple of blogs on the pandemic and how it's impacted our approach, and simply put, the effect was profound. Why was that? Well, consider that about 2/3 of our international polling over time has been conducted in person. It's entirely in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, and North Africa, but also much of Asia and Eastern Europe. And it's the widespread use of face-to-face interviewing throughout the world that's of particular significance when it comes to COVID, given the specific nature of coronavirus transmission, with the virus being spread mainly from person to person when they're in close contact. And if we left out the part about the virus, that describes how face-to-face interviews are typically conducted. So for ethical reasons, we stopped face-to-face polling in March 2020, and we haven't returned yet. So where are we now? Well, we're relying on phone surveys for the time being, and Pew's own online probability panel, the American Trends Panel, or ATP, in the US. And while we look forward to returning to 30 or more countries worldwide, we've been limited to countries in North America, Europe, and parts of Asia recently. So 14 countries last year we surveyed in for global attitudes, and 17 this past year. And those numbers are a far cry from the 34 countries we surveyed in 2019 as part of GAP. Now in this chart, a bit of a graphic representation, the 34 countries in GAP 2019 are represented by the green and tan colors, and these use a mix of face-to-face and phone methods. The 17 countries in green and gray represent the countries that we polled this past year by phone and in the US online. Note only New Zealand, Singapore, and Taiwan are unique in 2021 and shown in gray. A little harder to see, folks. Sorry about that. But what this speaks to, at least in part, are the methodological requirements we apply to using a mode in a country, and what we think about in terms of our specifications for a project. Again, that's not to say that it's the only approach or the best approach for all projects, but it's a methodology that allows us to have a high level of confidence in our data, and to be consistent with our past work. Now, what are some of the, thinking more broadly here for a moment, what are some of the considerations we think about when we consider shifting modes or a method of data collection? And it's not a simple choice, and it's informed by methodological and operational trade-offs, and it's required on a country-by-country basis. And I think just to draw a simple connection between the previous presentation that we had in the series, we're speaking to context here, and that's just a large part of what we do is accounting for that in our work. First off, there are direct trade-offs between mode of data collection and, simply put, how much of a country you can reach with a particular method. So, for instance, if the adult proportion of a country that owns a phone is between 90 or 95%, then you might start to think about using a phone survey. And I say start because that's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of requirements. But if phone penetration is around 50%, most of that 50% is in urban areas who have different views than folks in the countryside, then that's a problem if you want to generalize your results to an entire population as we do. On the other hand, while a face-to-face survey theoretically gives you the opportunity to reach all members of a population, it takes time, money, and close logistical management to send interviewers throughout a country while monitoring their progress and making certain that they adhere to the project design protocols. And so sending interviewers out to all parts of Russia or all the islands of Greece, well, that may simply not be practical. So those areas, even if not densely populated, could contribute to non-coverage in parts of a country. Known conflict zones within a country, of course, would be avoided. And there can be other challenges with face-to-face surveying, such as gaining access to those who live in gated communities or large locked apartment buildings. So if sizable segments of a population are not accessible in person and generally have different views on issues that you're measuring than the rest of the population, the results could, of course, be biased. Non-response plays out in a similar way by mode in terms of people who have a chance of selection, but are systematically hard to make contact with, or once contacted, it's hard to gain their cooperation. We generally gain more cooperation by face-to-face than by phone. And I guess that it's, at least from my own experience, it's easier to hang up on a telephone call or not pick up an anonymous caller than to slam the door in someone's face. And that can matter when thinking about mode. For instance, generally we find that women are more able to be interviewed by face-to-face in countries or by landline calling, but men are better represented by our mobile dialing. That landline versus mobile difference points to another implicit difference within a phone design. Now, there can certainly be measurement differences between modes. Face-to-face interviewers can build more rapport with respondents, and this can improve data quality and respondent motivation. Online interviewing, for instance, without interviewers can work well for more sensitive questions, but issues of attention and motivation with a self-explanatory survey need careful consideration. And there's a lot of value in having interviewers help folks, especially in countries with lower levels of literacy, make their way through an instrument. Now, one related consideration with measurement is length of interview and the number of questions you can ask. Pew surveys often run about 20 to 30 minutes in length. And frankly, interviewers with interviews of that duration, it can be a struggle on the phone, less so via face-to-face. You get no argument from me on that, folks. A 20 to 25-minute phone call is a long one in my book. Don't tell my mom, please. And it's simply longer in some languages versus others. For projects with longer questionnaires, phone simply might not be a good choice, as it's difficult to keep a respondent motivated and engaged throughout. Lastly, on the slide, I mentioned preserving trend. And for global attitudes, we have a large number of questions that we've been asking for many years. And that's really a key deliverable for us to report on whether views have changed over time within a country. Of course, if there's a change in mode, there can be an effect on responses and as well as sample composition. And that could distort how we understand the change over time and how we understand what's going on in a country. So it's something for us to think about in changing mode. Now here, in terms of measurement, I have this slide and the next one. I just want to quickly point to a couple of blogs we published on Pew Research Center's Decoded site that focus on mode and measurement. And this one's when we move from face-to-face to phone in Italy, and on the next slide, it's from phone to online in the US. And in one example from the Italy study, I just point to simply how the proportion of volunteered responses, those response options that are not provided to respondents as part of a closed-ended question, but are still accepted. And those can be much higher on face-to-face than phone, and can create a difficulty in understanding where public opinion is if you don't adjust for that. And there's a lot more in this blog for you folks to consider. The second one I just want to point to, also in Decoded, is the US mode comparison. And here I just pulled a finding about the difference in non-response and how it can be higher on phone than online. Now, there's a lot more in both of these studies, and we used for both a bridge study, and by that I mean we fielded surveys in both modes at the same time, so we can make direct comparisons between them. Okay. Here are a few operational issues that we consider in thinking about mode shifting. Pew Research, like most all clients for international survey projects, do not send their staff to do the interviewing in country. So we're dependent on the quality of firms that exist in country to execute the survey as we see fit and adhering to agreed upon practices. And that's a capacity issue. Operationally, there are many reasons for preferring a phone survey to a face-to-face survey, such as greater centralization of interviewers and consistency in sampling and interviewing, potentially lower costs, but not always, and potentially shorter field periods. But it's fair to ask whether firms available in a country can field a phone survey according to your technical specifications. And here I'm talking a bit about the technology and possibly physical space, but also to the approach of interviewing, which isn't the same across these interviewer-administered modes. For instance, are interviewers accustomed to gaining cooperation from respondents on the phone and really dealing with the higher rates of non-contact and refusal in comparison to face-to-face? Certainly a different dynamic in that one, really you need a fair amount of training and care to manage effectively. Survey respondents are only as motivated as our interviewers, and it's important to keep track of their well-being. Local familiarity I have in that first bullet point refers to whether firms are familiar with how people in their country will react to public polling, such as how people will react to strangers knocking on their door or receiving cold calls, asking them to chime in with their opinions about public figures in the government, and that can especially be the case in authoritarian countries. And of course, with any mode, firms, local firms, need to be able to assure compliance with legal and government requirements. So from the norms and rules about informed consent to whether the government needs to actually approve the survey instrument for fielding. Folks, costs certainly play a role in the decision making on our end, and they do vary by country greatly and by mode. And it may be that phone surveying is cheaper than face-to-face, but again, if an infrastructure is already built up, because there's no need to send interviewers across the country where they have to spend days in an area, which requires travel, hotel, and so on. But on the other hand, in many countries where the cost of labor and travel is relatively low, face-to-face may not cost any more than phone. Phone surveys are typically much faster to field, all things being equal. You may want your data sooner rather than later, but length of time in the field may not be a consideration and may not be as critical for all projects. And lastly, I have here a bit about organizational costs in the migration process, and that just speaks to whether there's the technical expertise to lead a new research project on a new mode. And that's a question both for the client and the local partners to answer, because it's really an alignment of expectations that can certainly facilitate project success. All right. Okay, so how did our surveys do during the pandemic? Now, in the next few slides, I share a few takeaways and thoughts about what happened, and maybe a few ideas on how we might think about creating efficiencies going forward. And this analysis that I'll describe here focuses on 10 countries we surveyed by phone in 2019 prior to the pandemic, and then in the 2 ensuing years. And to be clear, folks, you see the list on the slide. These are all developed economies with strong CADI infrastructure. So to be fair, what we found may or may not be applicable to countries that you're studying. I just want to be clear about that, but hopefully it's somewhat thought-provoking. A couple of broad points about the operations and fieldwork outcomes. Generally, with our phone surveys over time, all the countries completed the work within the allocated project timeframe, so it allowed for us to keep to our reporting schedules. On average, field work decreased by a few days when we entered into the pandemic, but on average, it increased a couple of weeks, in the second year, with a few countries taking over 3 weeks to complete surveying by phone. Now, there is a confounding factor here, as there often is. We had a server update at a call center during fieldwork that slowed progress, which is not a COVID-related delay. And I raised that all the issues that you have during a regular survey cycle are still apparent during the pandemic. So it sometimes can be challenging to single out what was a pandemic-related cause and not. Also, in terms of fieldwork and operations, 3 of our countries use call centers, centralized calling throughout the pandemic. Others pivoted away from a call center approach to remote dialing by 2020. But in neither case did we confront significant staff shortages or disruptions due to staffing. And in both cases, with centralized calling and decentralized, there were a variety of precautions we had to take, in-house calling with enhanced cleaning procedures, and with remote calling to ensure security and data privacy, and also the consistency in the sampling and the dialing approach. One really, I think, positive outcome that we found during the past couple of years is the greater use of technology by some of our partners that allowed for greater access to trainings by our staff, and that's helpful, I think, really in doing this type of work going forward. When you're fielding in 20, 30 countries at once, it's hard to be in all places at once. So the remote access was really appreciated. It just makes me think of before the pandemic, for one vendor that was several time zones away. I had to place a call to listen in on training in the middle of the night, and it wasn't a 1-800 number, folks, toll free, and that was quite a bill when I got from on my phone after that. So thank you, Zoom and WebEx and all you other platforms. But the greater use of technology and thinking of the future of work, the at-home interviewing, the remote access, these all point to possibilities in the future. So in some ways, I think we're taking steps forwards for a different approach for telephone interviewing in the future. Few words about survey outcome rates. We found that the respondents were generally not more difficult to interview during the pandemic. When we looked at the overall response rate, that's the A4RR3 coding of it, and these tended to be within a point or two of the pre-pandemic rates, which was encouraging. I would note that the response rates by phone are largely in the single digits, so movement is fairly restricted. And we noticed a slight overall improvement from 2019 to 2020, followed by a slight decrease in the following year. Generally, the contact rates were stable, but we did find it a little more difficult to make contact via mobile over time, with a little more variability on landline. Cooperation, on the other hand, showed some larger differences, with, I'd say, an overall trend towards more cooperation rather than less. But again, there was a lot of variability between countries. For instance, in Canada, Germany, and Spain, cooperation increased in the first year of the pandemic, but then decreased by about the same amount in the second. Japan saw, increase in cooperation go up and remain stable. Australia, yet a different pattern, initial increase in cooperation, then dropping in the second year below pre-pandemic levels in 2021. And there were some differences between landline and mobile there. And I'd love to have shown you folks a chart here, but the intertwining of all the lines made it largely incomprehensible to me. Now, in terms of dialing efficiencies, folks, here is a little bit more thinking ahead. With our pivoting to phone for a greater extent, we're looking at ways that we can improve our dialing, frankly, to reduce burden on our partners and potentially to reduce cost and the time in the field. Now, our standard approach has to make 7 contact attempts for each piece of release sample for our phone surveys. And that's been our standard for a long time. And in fact, we can complete, anywhere from 10 to 20% of the total sample on the 6th and 7th attempts. and we saw very little change in that during the pandemic. But preliminary analysis that we're looking at closely right now suggests that sample composition may not warrant the additional rigor for those additional calls. So we may be able to shorten our contact regimen, in the future. Use of a screen or pulse sample. Over time, we've simply used unscreened or unpulsed sample. So we haven't tried to exclude non-working numbers prior to dialing. And the reason for that has been there's a certain amount of imprecision with some of these processes. In some countries, indeed, it's quite precise, and the identification of non-working numbers is clear. In others, there's variability, year to year with how accurate it can be, which can lead to some levels of non-coverage. So we're looking at that, and perhaps to have a little bit more customization of our use of screen sample. I'm also looking into some partners who have more robust dialing systems that may mitigate some of the risk in processing large volumes of numbers. And here, folks, it can be large volumes. In a study we're looking at now, on the mobile sample, we're getting close to 60% of non-working numbers that we're dialing, and on landline, upwards of 90%. So that's a lot of numbers simply to process, and that could lead to other issues with the telecom systems that we'd most certainly like to avoid. So we'll continue to monitor this over time, and try and share other findings that we get from it. And sample representativeness, I guess, at the end of the day, this is maybe the most important feature. We saw no evidence of a sizable shift along any key dimensions of sample performance during the pandemic. And here, thinking in terms of gender, age, education, geography. Now, there is some evidence that our sample quality via phone is skewing towards those with more years of formal education, especially in a few European countries. And to a lesser extent, we're seeing some age effects, but that varies a bit more. But to be honest, these were trends, especially with education, that predate the pandemic. So we need to continue to look more closely into this, and to explore potential ways to improve our sample representativeness by phone, and to assess whether it's still a viable option for us going forward. And perhaps in the future, there's a greater call for using more of a, say, mixed mode method, not rely simply on phone to do our work. Now, kind of thinking ahead a little bit, I want to be fair to questions and to everyone's time today. Looking ahead, now we'll continue to explore different modes of data collection, really so we have different tools in our survey toolbox. And as long as we can gain a representative quality sample, again at a reasonable cost and completed within our timeline, it would have value to us. So currently, right now, we have a number of exploratory phone projects in the works, specifically in Latin America. And we're also looking at several online probability-based panels, primarily in Europe, but elsewhere too. And the heart of the matter, folks, when it comes to mode, is really finding the best way to reach people. And what works in one country may not work in another. So we have to customize this a bit, as we've done in the past. And it may be best to use phone or probability-based panels in the future, or post-pandemic, whenever that might be. There may be a greater return back to face-to-face interviewing. So that'll be interesting to see and to monitor. We've learned a lot in the past year, and we're likely to learn a lot more in the coming months. All right, just to kind of move away a little bit from the formal presentation, folks, I just want to share a few web links, Twitter handles, and a newsletter where you can follow some of the work done by the international side at the center, but also our vigorous domestic survey researchers. So it's all there for you. Here, just wrapping this one up, Noam and Luke, so you know what's coming. Here's my contact information and that of our communications manager, Hannah. So if you use our late data, it'd be fabulous to let us know. And lastly, I'll just take responsibility for what's here, put up my contact information, and to really ask you folks to feel free to contact me directly if you want to talk more about this beyond the Q&A that's coming up. And please share any questions and comments that you have. I'd love to hear from you.
Great. So thanks for that really interesting presentation. It sounds really familiar to what we've been experiencing at LAPOP. So it's nice to share in some of those struggles. Yeah, so for all the attendees, you can either post your questions in the Q&A or raise your hand and I can unmute you and you can ask Pat directly. So why don't we just get into it with the first question from Martha McRoy, who says, I'm surprised that data collection wasn't quicker for a phone survey than face-to-face. Were there average differences in completes by day or week? Did sample size change? Did lengths of interviews change?
Thanks, Luke, and thank Martha, who, in fairness to her, Martha was with Pew Research Center until recently, and she is the author of the 2 blogs I posted there. So I'm glad she's here to answer any questions about those. Data collection for phone surveys, well, Martha knows this. We simply were doing phone throughout the pandemic and in countries where we generally did phone before. So those timelines pretty much kept to where they were outside of the server update issue I mentioned. So since we haven't gone back to face-to-face, and apologies if I didn't explain that clearly, I mean, I can't say whether the face-to-face would take longer, if I'm understanding your question correctly.
Okay. Martha, did you have a follow-up to that?
Okay. Well, thanks for clarifying, Martha. Sorry about that, folks. No, we were simply just all surveying by phone, and the analysis at the end was just in those 10 phone countries.
CADI during the pandemic took longer than before the pandemic. Is that correct?
Yes, to a certain extent, but as I mentioned, there was that server issue that slowed our progress. So if we're saying that it was because of the pandemic, I'm hesitant to say that's the case. We actually got slightly greater cooperation from respondents. I don't know if it was because they had more free time or more engaged with talking about the pandemic and sharing their experiences. Thank you, Martha.
So a question from Danielle Montalvo. Hi, Pat, thanks for the great talk. What is your take on the future of self-administered web surveys with probability panels around the globe?
Yeah, hi, Daniel. It's good to hear from you as well. Yeah, I think there's a lot of value in going that route, and my experiences may be different from others. And again, it just speaks to like my objectives in terms of survey research and for managing projects like Global Attitudes. There's certainly many online vehicles out there, and there are maybe more probability-based ones than I'm in a position to leverage. A number of them focus on, regional or in-country clienteles. Some, offer a limited space for projects. Just showing up with 20 to 25 minutes of questions might not fly on all vehicles. And according to our reporting deadlines, it might not quite adhere to that. So I'm really thinking about commercial-based probability online panels here, and there's, I think, quite a bit of good work being done, and some of the work that started before the pandemic has accelerated over time. There have been releases publicly in the media about different companies. I see mostly in Europe. Noam and Luke could perhaps speak to Latin America, but developments where firms are investing in this method, suggesting that there is a clientele for probability-based online panels. And from what I'm seeing, and maybe my limited experience, the cost can be substantially cheaper. Looking at a fraction of the cost, maybe as much as half the cost of, say, a phone survey. And again, that depends in country and the price of labor in a country. In some developed markets, having interviewers you calling, that's just quite expensive, where a phone survey can run well, beyond $100,000, again, according to our specifications. And you might be able to do much better economically by that. I would just mention that with probability panels, and again, based on my limited experience, there is a certain amount of their approach that you have to accept with going into it, that we can often customize, and to our vendors' chagrin, do a lot of customization with our protocols. But the panels that I've engaged with, and I think they're I'm very optimistic about them, but there is more of an approach that they have. I mean, these are their panelists over time, and they're managing them in a certain way. And if we want to ask, our demographic questions on top of their profile questions, there comes a certain amount of redundancy. So it's maybe just developing, just for me at least, a slightly different sensibility about, about the levers that we can control with a project. But I think there's a great appetite for different vehicles, Daniel, and I look forward to engaging with them further.
Great. So you kind of referenced, kind of answered a little bit this question, but Sang-Noon Kim asked if there were any pros in conducting phone surveys as opposed to in-person surveys about data quality, coverage, and saving money. So you talked about how it's cheaper and some of the coverage issues. So if I could adapt that question a little bit to make it do you think face-to-face is a gold standard, or are these just different modes that have pros and cons?
Yeah, it's so I get this way, I guess, when we talk about our cross-national work, and I think Noam and Luke, I think you maybe do a little of the same, but well, I mean, it depends, and it's hard to say what's the gold standard anymore, since with face-to-face, some countries are just terrifically difficult to manage a face-to-face survey, whether it's due to inaccessibility, due to conflict, due to high rates of crime, just is inaccessibility of certain areas. It just can be so challenging. And gosh, with the pandemic, we were just confronted by that issue of sending people out there into the field. And while we've relied on face-to-face for a good part of our work, I mentioned about 2/3 of Pew's international work is by face-to-face, there are known challenges with data quality and managing logistics with a face-to-face survey. And this is not to point a finger at the interviewers. Frankly, they have the hardest jobs in the entire process. mean, I'm sitting in my apartment right now in DC. They're the ones making it all work. So any problems in the field are likely due to things that we haven't seen or accounted for. But frankly, it's hard to have the data quality measures that are available in phone, or the centralization of protocols that you can have, in a call center out in the field. And those are just simply some of the known problems. I don't think there's one blanket gold standard, anywhere. And I'm, beginning to think that there's not one even within country, which is, well, if they're both viable methods, I mean, that's a good thing for folks in our shoes, that we have alternative routes to go, and maybe a quicker timeline for a short fuse project would be really attractive. But for a project that has, that takes, better part of 40 minutes, like you guys, your surveys are, I think, a little bit longer than ours. Face to face, all things being equal, might be preferable in some ways. So wish there was a gold standard. If someone's got one, I'll take it. But for now, it's a case by case basis, I guess.
So speaking of the length of interviews, Carlos Lopez asked, what impact has the change in methodology had on the duration of interviews and therefore the quality of information collected?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Speaks to the heart of the tension, and I think a number of cross-national projects, just to frame it out, we get, say with the Global Attitudes Project, in fairness to our researchers, this is their one opportunity, generally a year to, collect a lot of information and write these really, ambitious and thoughtful reports, so that they're trying to, squeeze as much into the instrument as they can, being mindful of, the patients for respondents. And I think they've done a really good job of being mindful of how long you can keep someone in an interview, and they have a keen awareness of the impact on data quality, and that with each minute of a survey at a certain threshold, it can start to decrease. So I think you have to be mindful of that going in on what you can ask. So we've gotten our surveys down to about, in the low 20-minute range, which is still a lot. And maybe I have the worst survey karma of any survey researcher. Strikes me as quite a bit. But we're able to manage that. But it always means that tough choices have to be made on your questionnaire, and it's going to lead to some disappointment, for reporting. But you just I guess say wait till next year, as a good Brooklyn Dodgers fan, I suppose. And in terms of the data quality, I think it's been solid overall. Pew Research, we're not. Our questionnaires are typically not our international surveys asking for a lot of sensitive information. So we are talking about, confidence in world leaders, favorability, and general opinion. So we can ask essentially the same instrument across countries. So it is at a higher level. Now, folks asking more sensitive questions, questions of an intimate nature, that might play out a little differently for those instruments, but for ours, and they're all online for folks who want to take a peek at it. I think we've done fairly well with that. And I think the trend lines that we've had during the pandemic, at least with the attitudinal estimates, I think they're quite reasonable. And what we've known from in country, they have a certain amount of ground truth to them. So we're pleasantly surprised by that.
Question from Matthew Winters, my dissertation advisor. Could you say more about the use of screen samples? How does that process work? What are the pros and cons? Oh,
that's good. I love when I'm pressed on the limitations of my technological prowess. So it's a little gross here, folks, but generally it's this method that many vendors and sample providers use to attempt to screen out non-working numbers that aren't in use or perhaps disconnected. And there's a variety of flags that you can get when purchasing a sample. And it can lead to greater calling efficiency if you're scooping out the non-working numbers. And again, depending on the dialing system, it can just facilitate that you're actually calling working numbers, and they'll connect to your interviewing staff, and that can facilitate a completed interview. With some dialing systems, a lot of non-working numbers, if they're flooding the system, can frankly just slow the connection between the number dialed and the interviewer getting a respondent on the other end. So you have interviewers simply wasting time, and they're not interviewing during the course of the day. I mentioned that some vendors have maybe more robust, more sophisticated predictive dialers, and that can work through large volumes of numbers. So that's one avenue to explore if you're looking at vendors. But a concern with dumping so many numbers or trying to call them, I believe there are certain flags that telecom systems may use to identify organizations that are doing this kind of mass, almost like spam calling, and then you can get your number blocked, your outgoing number blocked. So we're trying to be mindful of that. So screening numbers or this pulsing process has a lot of appeal, like screen out the non-working numbers. I am all for that. The problem that we've encountered in recent years is that we've been calling all the numbers, again, to the chagrin of our vendors sometimes, but having the flags placed in the data. So that's a form of paradata that a screening or pulsing process would have considered this non-working or working. We're going to call it anyway, and we're going to call with our call design. And on the back end, when we get the data, we can see if that was actually a non-working number or not during field work. And we've seen there's a fair amount of variability between countries, but certainly for some countries, it makes sense to use the screening or the pulsing, because you can be calling, and I'm not kidding, thousands upon thousands of non-working numbers to get really the needle in the haystack. And then the rate of return on that is essentially zero, and you're spinning your wheels. So I'd encourage researchers, when they're looking at phone vendors, to look into that and find find some accuracy metrics for them. I mean, the next step for us to do is to look a little more closely about the impact on sample composition, because I think that's eventually where you want to be. So are these, the ones that would have been pulled by a screening process, are those folks systematically different in some way? Or are these just random numbers that would have been pulled and not lead to any bias in our outcomes? So that's another step in the process. But we typically have been sticking with the unscreened sample, unpulsed, because of this of the uncertainty of whether we're going to be screening out a large portion of actually working numbers.
Great. And because of our orientation towards Latin America, we have a couple of questions about your experience with Latin America. So what do you, from Jimena Rodriguez, what do you think would be the situation for surveys in Latin America for 2022? And then Cassandra Emmons asks, are any of your local partners still working in the region?
No, good questions. And the two of you can chime in on this to a much greater extent than me. The situation, I could just say for our surveys in Latin America, usually don't have cats in my office at work, so that's either a plus or a minus. That's all kinds of wrong. Yeah, don't have tape on the desk, folks. Cats don't like it on their feet. Sorry. So for for Latin America for next year, we are looking into different options for phone surveying. To be fair, and we have been connecting with the folks at LAPOP about opportunities down there. Again, so that's why these conversations are really important. I think there's a lot of capacity to do quality phone work in Latin America. So we're looking into that very closely. And when we get a better sense of where the pandemic stands in Latin America, and there are excellent firms, across the region. And from my knowledge, Noam, Luke, you could maybe say more. My knowledge, all the partners that we've worked with in the past are up and running. And since we're not using face-to-face, doesn't mean that they've stopped doing face-to-face work. Many have gone into organizations, vendors have gone into the field faster than we're ready to. And I can't speak to what other organizations, how they make their decisions. It's not quite the right time for us just yet, but it has given us the opportunity, which I don't think was there, say, about 4 or 5 years ago. I remember talking to some really great vendors in Mexico about doing phone surveys, and one response I got was like, "Well, we could, do that, but why would we? I mean, face-to-face works fine," and that head of the organization I spoke with, it was like, it actually doesn't cost that much to send people across the country, they're out in the field for a few days. It's fine. I mean, to build a survey center, like, that's a lot. And he clearly explained to me why interviewing would simply just be very different for staff. So it would take a lot of upscaling, to build that. You had a viable method. But the pandemic changed, folks' tune about it. So I think once the infrastructure is built up, hopefully a little bit more, maybe folks pivot to phone in greater numbers, will be much more widely used and available method phone. I think there's a lot of pluses to doing phone surveys that I'd love to leverage, but heck, I'm pretty greedy. I mean, if you can offer me phone face-to-face and online, all of high quality in countries, and I had my pick of them, I'll sign up for that.
Yeah, I don't know. Did you want to talk about our experience with phone surveys or our plans? I think we're still kind of undecided for 2022, seeing how things play out. And I know there are some firms that are back to doing in-person stuff with appropriate, sanitary protocols, but we're still unsure.
Yeah. I see another question went in. If I may jump in, Luke. Dual frames for surveys, if I'm reading that one. It depends on the country. In a country like South Korea, we've been mobile only for some time. Most countries, it's dual frame, so a mix of landlines and cells, and leaning more into the mobile phones over time. So slightly moving our allocations in that direction. But in certain countries, there are segments of the population that are more accessible via landline, and they think differently than maybe the younger men you might get in some countries, predominantly on mobile. So it's definitely something to look at with your phone surveys. But I think mobile is offering a lot of opportunity to at least address some of the challenges we have in getting younger folks, and I'm hopeful about that. The education skew is taxing right now, but again, I wouldn't point to COVID as the culprit there. I think it's something that, Luke, you might be able to speak to it in your surveys. It's always been there to some extent. It was there, not to the same degree with face-to-face, but this isn't a new issue for us to grapple with.
Yeah, we've definitely been experiencing that as well. So seeing no more questions, I think we can wrap up there since we're past the hour. So everybody could join me in thanking Pat for his presentation and sharing all the developments that have been happening at Pew. Give a virtual clap in the chat.
Yeah, no, thank you all for making the time. And again, for the two of you for hosting. This is a fabulous opportunity, and I look forward to the December event and hopefully more to come in the spring.
Yeah.
I'll just mention that December 15th will be back for our next session with Frauke Kreuter and some of her colleagues at Maryland.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks, everybody.
Take care, folks.
Thanks. Bye.